If you've been following my channel, well, actually, first of all, I apologize for uploading so late, but moreover, you might notice that I already have some opinions that at least seem like autistic nationalism, and I do consider myself an autistic nationalist. In fact, you yourself might already believe some things that are akin to autistic nationalism, but I've always been hesitant to say autistic nationalism or autistic nationalist outright, because when you say X nationalism, say black nationalism or Native American nationalism, you are immediately equated to a white supremacist, even if the movement is fighting against racism.
White people need to stop wearing dreadlocks and they need to stop appropriating black people's music.
Shaved heads and country music, the way God intended.
So, just to be clear, because I actually don't know your views on this, you don't think that we should give the land back to indigenous people?
If that involved deporting the people who live here who aren't indigenous, then God, no, absolutely not. I don't think we could fix one genocide with another one. I think there are ways to address the problems with Native American people here today involving land redistribution or forms of reparation and stuff. But if it involves displacing millions of Americans, that seems I don't know, that seems pretty bad.
Considering that autistic people are surrounded by constant anti-autistic sentiment, I find that autistic nationalism is necessary, if not inevitable. But let me explain why I believe that. Nationalism essentially means that you are loyal or you believe in a group or nation. However, that nation or group of people can be defined by anything, which is why nationalism itself is so broad. It isn't necessarily left-wing or right-wing. Now, the exact definition of left-wing and right-wing varies a lot, which is why you get a lot of ridiculous claims like the Nazis were left-wing. Sometimes they're even portrayed as more leftist than, say, socialists. However, the definition of left and right that I am using relates to power hierarchies. Leftists want smaller hierarchies, less stratification, and the right wants more. So, for example, socialism is extremely left-wing because it's against the stratification and hierarchy that capitalism creates, whereas capitalism is definitely right-wing because it seeks to preserve, maybe even add to the hierarchy that capitalism brings. And just so nobody is confused here, socialism has nothing to do with the government. You don't need more or less government. Rather, socialism refers to the collective ownership over the means of production. So, for example, in capitalism, the means of production are privately owned by corporations and CEOs and people who bought the businesses. Whereas in socialism, such leaders would have to be elected by the working class. In a nutshell, socialism is about maximizing economic democracy, although that is a bit of a simplification. I also want to clarify the difference between race and ethnicity. You see, race is essentially made up. It's the idea that certain physical characteristics determine whether a person is part of a group, and they are imagined to have psychological differences, whereas ethnicity relates to the actual culture and history of people, at least in the anthropological sense. For example, black nationalism doesn't necessarily refer to a black race, but rather in African American, or more generally, African ethnicities. The nature of oppressed nationalism is inherently different from the nationalisms of those who think that they are oppressed. For example, most Western nations cannot be left-wing nationalists, with some exceptions. Like, for example, Canada has a very leftist civic nationalism, and the only other exception I can think of is if they go against someone bigger, like the capitalist, the bourgeoisie. If they're anti-capitalist instead of anti-ethnic minority, then that's definitely left-wing. But otherwise, nationalism is impossible without punching sideways or punching down. But Irish nationalism, for example, tends to be left-wing. It isn't always left-wing, of course. None of them are, but it tends to be left-wing because it's against the power Britain has. It's against British imperialism and colonialism that has ruled over Ireland for so long. The key difference between oppressed nationalism and oppressor nationalism is what you can give. In oppressor nationalism, there is almost nothing to actually give to the group that you're supporting because they already have the power. They already have power more so than the group that's being oppressed. Whereas in oppressed nationalism, you do actually have something to give in terms of culture, politics, society, and economy. You actually have something to give them because if they had power, they would already use it for their benefit. Lacking power and resources, there's something to build with oppressed nationalists rather than just something to take. This is what makes oppressor nationalism so infantile. You basically have a bunch of people who don't face the same problems faced by those more oppressed. Nothing that can't be solved with regular, not national socialism. Notice how white supremacists will often do a bunch of genocide against people that didn't do anything, but you never see, for example, a neo-Nazi breakfast program, nor do you see an equivalent to the Fruits of Islam. And I actually do like to use the Nation of Islam as an example because they are rightist in many aspects, and they are definitely racist, but it's not the same as white nationalism because they do actually have something to give. They do actually have something to build, or at least something to build that isn't going to be the same for oppressor nationalism, white nationalism. Autistic people have a lower birth rate, have a lower chance of getting into a relationship, and in general, more loneliness. And autistic people are less likely to get the high and stable income that everyone else has. But why are we turning to autistic nationalism out of everything available? Firstly, we seem to be controlled, at least culturally, economically, socially, and politically, by very racist institutions, which is very disturbing because they're very racist against us and they have no right to control us. Now, first of all, I would like to point out that there isn't really an autistic ethnicity, at least not yet. The only exceptions I can think of is the Neanderthals, if you posit the autistic Neanderthal theory, and extremely recently, but at least right now, there isn't really an autistic ethnicity. But nonetheless, autistic people do face racism. Now, if we are being technical here, it isn't actually racism, because, at least technically speaking, autistic people aren't distinguished based on physical features. In fact, autistic people do have actual mental differences, but the mental differences stated by autism awareness and perceived by autism awareness is not based on actual autistic psychology, but rather an imagined state of being created to fit a particular narrative, especially the narrative of the capitalists running autism awareness. So, at least in effect, it is racism because people are creating a narrative that is supposedly scientific but is essentially imaginary and used to support a particular agenda. In the scientific racism of the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was to justify imperialism. And similarly, autism awareness is used to promote capitalist agendas, such as ABA. In fact, autism awareness has nothing to do with autistic people, except for the fact that, as a capitalist tool, it is used to exploit autistic people, but it has much more to do with capitalism than autistic people. Another thing to consider is that in the long term, there will be an autistic ethnicity for multiple reasons exactly, but the most natural, the one I want to point out, is that only autistic people seem to care about their own existence, not that neurotypicals aren't willing to collaborate or help autistic people, period. There's certainly a bunch of neurotypicals that have, say, autistic friends and family members that they are willing to help out. However, neurotypicals as a whole won't care whether or not autistic people go extinct. In fact, there are more neurotypicals that want autistic people to go extinct than there are neurotypicals that don't want autistic people to go extinct. This is evident by the fact that non-autistics rarely address autistic problems like loneliness among autistic people, lack of high and stable income to keep up with everyone else, the fact that the autistic population is declining, or at the very least they should address whether or not the autistic population is declining, which, as it turns out, it is. And nor do they do anything about autism awareness. Autism awareness has dominance, and they let it happen. This isn't to say that we can't collaborate with non-autistics, but the problems autistic people face can only be solved with autistic projects. Now, I believe in a balance between reform and revolution when it comes to praxis, but to relate to what Kev the Marxist said, the same institutions which allow autism awareness aren't going to suddenly change their minds after a few protests. But the most esoteric and, in my opinion, the most interesting part of autistic nationalism is the implications autistic nationalism has for culture, or at least culture regarding autistic people. Now, there's going to be a more negative and more positive aspect of this, and I want to get the negative aspect over with first. You see, it's essentially impossible for me to leave autism awareness alone, because autism awareness won't leave me alone, and moreover, by contributing to a genuine autistic culture, society, and language, I am threatening the monopoly autism awareness has over anything regarding autistic people. Now, regarding autistic people, there is some alternatives, kind of, but there is still so much internalized autism awareness that if you're not getting it from a direct source, you're getting it from a source that has internalized it a lot, or at least has internalized it, period, which is already bad enough. Take a second to think about every person in your house, including yourself. Everyone you thought about has some form of internalized autism awareness, and I myself do as well. And you can't know exactly what you've internalized, or at least you can't know what you've internalized, generally speaking. However, you can understand that you do have some internalized autism awareness by the fact that there is no autistic society, culture, language, and academia, at least not in significant amounts. So everything has to come from autism awareness because that's the only other alternative. The worst part is that autistic people have actually internalized it more than anyone else because, well, autism awareness is inherently anti-autistic. People who support autism awareness are most likely to talk about or at least refer to autistic people. So directly or indirectly, they have a monopoly on all information regarding autistic people. It's actually kind of hard to think or say anything because I have to constantly distinguish what comes from autism awareness and what comes from autistic people, but I don't know it all, so in this video alone, I probably made at least 7 assumptions made by autism awareness. But I know at least that autistic nationalism is the right direction, or at least better than autism awareness. It's also worth noting that autism awareness isn't just internalized through information or through information directly, with the Pygmalion effect and ABA being pretty good examples. I feel like I actually phrased the last part wrong somehow, but this will be an easier task for autistic nationalism to help with, because we know for certain that ABA and the stigma against autistic people come from autism awareness. Whenever someone asks me what to replace autism awareness with, I feel quite insulted because it implies that autism awareness has merit at all. But while autism awareness is so toxic, it's not the only thing concealing autistic psychology or autistic nature. There are multiple layers that have been built over time which conceal the true nature of autistic people, and autism awareness isn't even the main one. That would have to go to neurotypical society. Now, there's nothing wrong with neurotypical society. It certainly has its merits. But neurotypicals, their society at least, are so unnatural to autistic people that it ends up concealing the true nature of autistic people. The actual autistic psychology and culture would be so alien that we can't really understand it, especially not while autism awareness is present. But even if we got rid of that, it would still be almost impossible to predict what it would actually be like. And this is especially true because of double empathy and its implications for how autistic people are nurtured in a neurotypical society. I want you to close your eyes and imagine an island or somewhere isolated where all the natives are autistic people. Now, let's say that they have fully adapted to the industrial world, but they are still culturally isolated. What does that culture look like? What is that culture? Now, it's almost impossible to actually know, but whatever that culture would be is what I think we should strive for. This is actually somewhat exciting for me because it's akin to a mural or something like that, and you can only see the vague shape. You can't see the actual artwork, and you may never even get to see the artwork, but you are able to see the bits of paint that are falling off. Of course, some guesses are more educated than others, but we cannot truly guess this. Our only option is to constantly experiment with what an autistic culture could be. Now, already, autistic people have already adopted a certain set of ideas, values, and worldviews by virtue of reacting to neurotypical society. However, culture is complex and chaotic. Then again, saying that, I don't think you realize how complex and chaotic is. In fact, just saying that, I think it undermines it. Imagine your mind, but at least millions of times stronger. Yes, we can scientifically observe autistic neurodevelopment, and yes, we do have history so that we can meet a person, say, 100 years ago, or maybe even 1,000 years ago. But ultimately, we will not understand autistic people until we see the original and natural context. But one thing seems almost obvious. Autistic people have potential. Prejudice against autistic people does not. This is Autistic signing out.